Hello, this is John Majori with MajoriOnBowie.com, and this is the MajoriOnBowie.com YouTube channel, where I post a new interview every week that has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog, www.majorionbowie.com, for daily content. Today, I have a very special guest that I've been looking forward to talking with for quite a while, Glenn Hendler, a professor of English and American Studies at Fordham University, whose work spans literature, cultural studies, and popular music. But for our purposes today, it's his work on David Bowie that takes center stage. He's the author of David Bowie's Diamond Dogs, part of the 33 and a third series, where he explores the album as a pivotal moment in Bowie's career, one that saw him breaking away from the Ziggy Stardust persona and constructing an entirely new dystopian future. His book examines how Diamond Dogs reflects Bowie's fascination with Orwell, Burroughs, and glam excess, while also challenging ideas of identity, fame, and artistic reinvention. It also happens to be one of my favorite albums, but somehow that detail got left out of the book. Beyond that, Glenn has written about Bowie's impact in other contexts, including a thoughtful reflection on the song Kooks that he posted in the days following Bowie's death, considering how Bowie's music shapes personal and cultural memory. His broader work includes studies in American literature, cultural theory, and the power of pop music. But today we're here to talk about Bowie and Diamond Dogs. So Glenn, welcome.
Great to be here.
So this book, which I will hold up, it's invisible because of my background. It was first published in 2020, which there it is. There we go.
Sort of.
Yes.
Invisible.
So I noticed it was published in 2020. I read it this year, but 2020 was the most dystopian time that we've experienced. And I was wondering, for me, the album, which I've always liked, became sort of my personal soundtrack that year. And I was wondering if the events of 2020 influenced your analysis and your writing, or was the writing mostly done by the time it was published?
I'm afraid the writing was done before it was published, and for obvious reasons. So like the pandemic didn't really play into it in a direct way. It became sort of timely after the fact in a way.
Yeah, yeah. So two other quick questions about the writing of the book before we get into the substance of it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me is you don't just do a lyrical analysis, but you get into detail about the music itself.
Yeah.
And, just looking at your professional background, it's not obvious. How do you know so much about music? Could you write this type of book without doing both?
So I don't think that it would have been as good a book. I don't want to brag about the book, but I don't think it would have been anywhere near as good a book if all I did was an English professory kind of analysis of the lyrics. So I sort of taught myself a lot about music. And in addition, I also drew on other people's expertise. So I cite them in the footnotes. I talk about the different people who I encountered who were musicologists, people I read, there's a really great musicological analysis of the song "We Are the Dead" that's out there that I drew on a great deal. And I happen to know from high school one of the sons of Dave Brubeck. And since one of the questions of the book ends up being, what is that weird time signature of that final tune on Diamond Dog? I thought I would call him up and say, who knows more about time signatures than the child of Dave Brubeck, after all?
Yeah.
And he helped a great deal.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who helped, a lot of other people's ideas that are playing into it.
There was actually one of your sources, actually two of your sources, I found interesting. As you mentioned them twice, a couple of Facebook groups, Bowie Kooks and the Church of David Bowie, and I thought irony is the wrong word, but in a book that focuses quite a bit about the relationship between the artist and the audience, that you went to the audience as an actual source, and you mentioned that you learned things that you didn't otherwise know from these groups. What's going on there?
That's an interesting question, and it's interesting the way things have developed. Like I don't think I've the Church of David Bowie is a group that was lively 5 years ago, and I don't think it's very lively right now.
Yeah,
Or at any rate, I haven't come across a lot of many things. Bowie Kooks is a bit more lively. Bowie Fascination is probably the group that is most that I think you're in as well.
yeah,
That is most lively and that is most engaging. There and Bowie fans are smart for one thing. Bowie fans have been taught by him to have an intellectual engagement, and are the kind of people who want to have intellectual engagements. So they did really teach me things. They had thought about things about the way the album worked that I hadn't considered. So I learned a great deal from just joining those groups and being part of the conversation, listening into the conversation, and hearing what people had to say. Um, he's always been, for me as well, a kind of teacher.
yeah,
And Bowie, I remember when I was 13 years old, 14 years old, something like that, going to the first, no, I'm dating myself, but going to the Station to Station concert, and he showed this film at the beginning of it. He showed a Chandelou. I had no idea what it was. I thought it was a movie he had made. Uh, in fact, I thought that main character of that movie was him in it. It was a movie made by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel. And it was years later before I saw that in a class. I
yeah.
actually was a film major as an undergraduate, so a film studies major. So I saw it in the class, and I shouted in the middle of the in the middle of the room. Wait a minute! I saw that movie before.
I
So
realized that as you're talking about it, I'm sort of unconsciously playing with my eye. So I,
yes,
yeah,
that movie. The film does have that eyeball scene where it's an eyeball is sliced open.
yeah,
And there's another website called Slicing Up Eyeballs. Um, yeah,
yeah,
that I've also learned from. But anyway, the it's a reference to that film.
yeah.
Anyway,
One of
he taught a lot, and he taught people a lot, and I think that there are people who teach each other a lot, who are inspired by Bowie.
there's sort of sticking with the theme of the back and forth. One of the first observations you make in the book, which becomes a theme for the duration of the book, is that something that I had never picked up on, even though I listened to the album. I've been listening to it for 40 years. Every song on the album contains an I directly addressing a you.
Yeah.
And you go on to then explain the concept of interpolation, which again is a theme of your book. So,
Mhm.
two questions. The first is that unusual for an album to have so many eyes addressing the you? And explain what interpolation is, and how important an effect it is to what Bowie's trying to do with the album.
So, first of all, it's not unusual for every love song is almost every love song is an I addressing a you, right?
Yeah,
And love poems that date long before pop songs. So there's a lot of popular music that is I love that basically the structure is I love you.
yeah,
Um, what's interesting about Diamond Dogs to me is that he uses that mode of address, but there's no love songs in there. Right. I mean, it's
yeah,
the closest thing is Rock and Roll with Me, and it's dubious love song at best. What are those lizards doing in the song? So at any rate, there's just no love song in it. So he's using it for some other purpose, and that always intrigued me. Now going to your other question, what is interpolation? Interpolation is it's a made up word that was made up by the French theorist Louis Althusser. Something I learned as an undergraduate. Um, Something I learned about as an undergraduate. That read his essay called "Ideological State Apparatuses." Very intellectual stuff. And it's always been an idea that's intrigued me. How does the process of addressing an audience also construct that audience, right?
yeah,
How does saying I love you actually make change the you? And that's what I think that's how I think Bowie is using the concept of interpolation. He's constantly shifting the I and the you throughout the album in really complicated and interesting ways. I have no idea how conscious he was of doing that, but he did it pretty systematically in the course of the album. So I think he was at least somewhat conscious of it.
Yeah, that's always something that I wonder is how how aware is he or was he of what he was doing? And whenever I read an analysis, or even when I do my own, like he had to have known this, right? It's like, but maybe not.
But
I don't know. Maybe it just
he,
comes naturally.
I mean, he's a funny guy, right? He was
Yeah,
a funny guy. He was an intellectual in certain ways.
yeah,
And read a lot. He read voraciously, right?
yeah,
There's that story of him carrying around a 400 bookcase with him on tours, and things like that. But he was self-taught as well as kind of a set of kind of a self-taught intellectual. He read voraciously, but read very curiously. He read a lot of books about supernatural things that, I don't believe everything he read. Let's put it that way.
yeah,
Uh, I don't believe in everything he read, but so he was doing stuff, and he would talk about doing things to his audience. And I think that's where the address to his audience matters, in that it matters to him, because he would say, I can make my audience do things, I
yeah.
can change my audience, I can affect my audience. He thought about his audience a lot. In not necessarily in exactly the ways I say in the course of the book, but in very self-conscious ways.
Well, you write that, and I'm paraphrasing here, popular singers can mass produce a feeling of intimacy, and that with Diamond Dogs, um, uh, Bowie demonstrates how rock and roll has the ability to form a dangerous kind of we.
Yes.
Yeah,
So, yeah. So every love song, again, mass produces intimacy, right? His the singing the I love you structure of a love song. You are wonderful, you are great, you're horrible, whatever it may be. There's a you out there, and there's a relationship between an I and a you that's being constructed in the song. Um, Bowie does some interesting things with that, and he plays with the dark side of that. And he had this idea that he always made these analogies between the rock star and the fascist, the rock star and the authoritarian leader.
yeah,
He said at one point Hitler was the first rock star. His playing with Nazi stuff is another story. It comes later than Diamond Dogs, but he was interested in Diamond Dogs, and he said that even some songs like Rock and Roll with Me, which seemed like the closest thing to a love song. Um, Even that kind of song, he said, was about his relationship with his audience. And that he felt like in that song he was protesting that his audience was making a hero out of him in a way that was scary,
yeah.
that was scary to him. And he didn't want to be that kind of figure most of the time. Once later in his life, he might have a little kind of gotten into it a little bit too much. But at the time of Diamond Dogs, he's really kind of exploring it and warding it off. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about the album.
Yeah, this is not one of my planned questions, but on that song, I, the line that sticks out to me, the lizard line sticks out because I have no good theory about what that is about.
Neither do I really.
But the tens of thousands found me in demand, I thought
Mm-hmm.
seemed to at least conceptually link that song to the rest of the album. But what you're talking about, right? And it's like I hadn't read the quote that you reference in the book, where he's talking about that song, um, until I read your book. But it actually kind of made sense, And my mind went to that song about tens of thousands found me in demand. So it's, you wrote somewhere in the book that he, night after night, he's getting on stage and experiencing this adulation,
Yes.
which he compares to a demagogic figure, but in other contexts, also a religious figure.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a quote that I think that he said to the photographer, Mick Rock, and I'm going to get it wrong, but essentially he says, we, meaning we rock stars, are the new gods.
And of course, he later on becomes good friends with John Lennon, who famously said, the Beatles are bigger than
Yeah.
Jesus, right?
Yeah.
There was this religious kind of idea among rock stars that they were the new prophets, and At times he would play with that. At times he would really shy away from that. He felt very ambivalently, I think, about that kind of power that was being given to him by his fans. So tens of thousands found me in demand is a really interesting line because they found me in demand. What a strange thing to say.
Yeah,
What a strange way to phrase it. They saw that he was in demand and therefore they became desirous of him. I don't know.
yeah,
I don't know
no,
exactly what to do with
right,
that line.
yeah. So you just said something about the fans empower him, and that I know, I've noticed in several of his songs, but on this album in particular, um, he discusses the power relationship. The crowd empowers its leaders, and it can also strip it away. So,
Hmm.
not on this album, but the kids killed the man, right? So,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
and or Signet Committee, all the way back to the Space Oddity album, right?
Hmm.
There's this powerful figure that is stripped of its power, but in this album, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. We want you, Big Brother. So Big Brother
Yeah.
being granted power by the masses, and I'm just gonna go do this out of order, Glenn. I'm gonna reveal to
Let's
you my
do.
big theory about Diamond Dogs, and you can shoot
Okay,
them.
please do.
So, and I'm going to come back to my notes, but to me, it has struck me that the yes, there's the chant of the ever circling skeletal family, but the last full song is Big Brother, and it to me it seems like everything that preceded it is the chaotic world that led to the conditions where the masses would want Big Brother.
Hmm.
And to turn this into a question for you, and I'm sort of becoming chaotic. I had a structured interview, Glenn. I'm going totally off, but
That's okay. That's okay. That
so
fits the way my mind works too.
you wrote about the song "The Sweet Thing Sweet," which I think you refer to it as "a Sweet Thing Sweet," so we don't have to say "Sweet Thing Candidate," "Sweet Thing Reprise," multiple
Right.
times.
Yes.
You,
That slight shorthand that had a little pun in it that
yeah,
was
you
kind of accidental, but it's okay. Anyway, go on.
there's part of the song that I might have misinterpreted what you were writing about it being sort of fantastic in a positive way. And specifically, I'm thinking about the line, we'll jump in the river holding hands.
Mm,
I always took to mean we're going to commit suicide. But
right.
did you view that to be a more romantic, we're just going to go for a swim?
No, I think the suicide. I think they take it
Yeah.
to be a suicidal moment, but a romantic suicide, right?
Yeah.
We'll buy some drugs and watch a band and jump
Yeah.
in the river holding hands, and that's the
Yeah.
last line of Candidate.
Yeah.
And before it sort of reverts into the Sweet Thing reprise. And it's a kind of, I mean, what I argue in the book is that it turns from being this William Burroughs story suddenly into a Bruce Springsteen song, which isn't a big switch, right? Which strangely isn't a big switch.
But
But
so
it is
explain that. I don't think that's obvious to everybody.
so like everything has been kind of chaotic. He's using the cut up method to construct the lyrics, which is
Yeah.
part of what he draws from Burroughs is the idea that you take lines and sort of cut them up and reassemble them. There's a lot of cut up method in that song. There's a lot of queerness in that song, right? There's a kind of sexual there's a lot of men having sex with each other in that
Yeah.
song. And then at the end, like who's the we, right? We don't know. It doesn't say, right? And that's part of the thing about songs is that they can say I love you and you don't know who the I is and who the you is, right? They can say we'll jump in the river holding hands. We don't know what who we is
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But if you're identifying, if you're if you're listening to the song, maybe singing along, maybe really getting into it, you're kind of in the we. You're part of that we. And you're either loving David Bowie or identifying with David Bowie. Either way, you're having this kind of chaotic experience, and then it's kind of resolving in suicide. So in this room, in what I would say is a romantic suicide, romantic in the larger sense of the word. It's obviously we're not just going for a swim.
Yeah.
Uh, I would counter that interpretation. I think we'll buy some drugs, we'll watch a band, we'll jump in the river holding hands. That's the end. And right after that, it goes into this saxophone guitar duet that is both him, which is really interesting in itself. And it goes into a different song.
Yeah,
Anyway, the point is he kind of resolved that in the couple. Whether it's a heterosexual couple is another question, but in the couple.
yeah.
And the couple then kills itself.
Well, yeah. Let's stick with that song for a moment because I think
Sure.
you know
Say a lot about it.
yeah, you mentioned it's one of my favorite songs, right? And
It's one of almost everybody's favorite songs.
yeah, you mentioned that, and I've observed that as well. Like not everybody's favorite song, Bowie fans' favorite songs, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
So
Everybody who matters.
so a couple of sort of interesting questions. The thing, the meaning of thing. You
Yeah.
you seem to very hesitantly introduce a theory as to what the word means in the context of the song. But
Mhm.
before you actually explain that, let me ask you this. Have you ever heard Ava Cherry's version that does not have the candidate in it?
Yes, yes, that's been a while.
Yeah. So I interviewed her, right? Wow, I got to
Yes.
Ava Cherry. Great.
I had like in the middle of the pandemic,
Yeah.
I ended up having an hour-long phone conversation with her too. That's
Oh,
one of the results of publishing this book has
yeah.
been that gotten to have conversations with lots of people who I never imagined as a teenage
Yeah.
Bowie fan would I that I would have personal contact with. But anyway, go on.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So we were talking about whatever we're talking about, and she asked me if I had ever heard her version of the song, and I said no, I never heard her version of the song. And so she said, well, you have to listen to it. So I listened to it, and
Hmm.
first of all, it was wonderful. It doesn't
Yeah.
have the candidate part; it's just one song,
Right.
and there were a couple of minor, but I think crucial lyrical changes. One of them is the line um, where Bowie ends the line with the word thing. You
Hmm.
want it, boys, get it here, thing.
Yeah.
In his version, she says, get it here now.
Oh, yes, yes, that's right. I did notice that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a theory about why he was using the word thing. What is it?
Okay, so it's an elaborate theory, and I can't prove it, right? But I do think that the word thing it stands out. It's not grammatically, it doesn't fit grammatically into the song. You want it, boys, get it here thing, because hope boys is a cheap thing.
Yeah.
The second time it's grammatical, the first time it's not. What is that thing doing there? And you know, on the one hand, it could just be some weird cut up stuff, right? He's just throwing in words that appear, but it ends up making it rhyme. But my theory is that he's drawing on a kind of queer subculture that he drew on a lot, right? He drew on for years and years, and less um, over the course of the 70s, toward the then into the 80s when he suddenly disavowed his bisexuality and so on. But in the 70s, he was still really engaged with that subculture,
Yeah.
and so and with I use the word subculture advisedly here. I think it's engaged with um, subcultural forms like language. So Miss Thing, which has different meaning now,
Yeah.
was a kind of figure in weird cartoons that I talk about. I can't remember the cartoonist, but I remember doing a bunch of research on how the word thing was used in Polari, in this language that was used by gay men to talk to each other, which we know from other interviews that Bowie was familiar with. Um, he used slang and words from this language Polari quite often. So I ended up looking at books on Polari, books on queer subcultures of the early 1970s, which we have to remember that Bowie declared himself um, gay. He had always, yeah, I was gay even when I was David Jones, he said in an
Yeah.
interview in 1972. Um, we have to remember that it was only a few years after England had decriminalized homosexuality. It was actually
Yeah,
quite a daring and new thing to say for him to say that, for him to say at that point. Um, anyway, thing is a kind of term of address. What I argue is that possibly the reason it's there is that it made sense to him as a term of address,
yeah,
that he's talking to somebody, he's talking to a thing, a boy who's a thing,
yeah.
and that fits with the rest of the song in certain ways too.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned the Ava Cherry version is that
Yeah.
I actually think that her the change of word makes sense. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it adds credibility to your theory, and it also made me think of how he uses the word thing in another phrase in three different songs. Pretty thing, right?
Hmm.
So, oh, you pretty thing,
Oh yeah.
and
Right.
then in Tin Machine, there's a song called Pretty Thing,
Things.
which within the lyric also within the song lyrics itself also uses Sweet Thing.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. And then after that, he has the Pretty Things Are Going to Hell.
Yeah.
And I think that I had never encountered that theory about that's what the word meant, but it also explains a possible through line that, he goes back to Polari on the album Black Star, right?
Right. All the way at the end of his life, he ends up doing a song in the mix of Nadsat and Polari,
Yeah.
the invented language in that's in Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, which it was an incredible influence on him in the 70s. And Polari
Yeah. And
words are both.
the Nadsat, right? I mean, that he's got the line in Suffragette City about droogies, right?
Yes.
And so it's like he's at the end of his life, he's referring back to, some of the devices he used, which I think adds credibility to that interpretation, right?
Yep.
The other thing that I thought of, you mentioned that he sort of disavowed his sexual identity in the 80s, but he actually didn't totally. Like, for instance,
Totally.
yeah, like on Let's Dance, the song Criminal World, which seems like filler, it's the most subversive song on the album because
Hmm.
it has gay themes, right? But it's like your casual listener doesn't even pick up on that.
I'm not sure I have. So I
Yeah,
must be a casual listener of that particular song. I kind of skip
yeah,
over. I kind of think I don't think about that song much. Uh,
yeah. Well,
tell, tell me.
it's a cover, right? And I think the
Yeah,
original version, and I'm actually drawing a blank. I wasn't planning to
Metro
talk about this song, but I'm drawing a blank on the original artist. But
Metro was the
yeah,
band.
okay, great. And I think that that original version, um it is more obviously it more obviously has gay themes in it.
Hmm.
And Bowie sort of pops it, like makes it more poppy, and he puts it on that second side of the album, which doesn't have the same sort of force as the first, and it's almost not very memorable, the second side of the album. But not originally, like when the album came out and I was a teenager, I wasn't really thinking about it. But I do think it was sort of like a code to his fan base coming into the album.
Hmm.
Anyway, all of this is in
Okay.
support of your reading of things. So let me ask you this:
Yeah.
do you have a
Okay.
theory about hamburger?
Yes. There's no doubt. There's no doubt that the word hamburger is in there.
Yeah,
And I think it's a little reference to America, and I think it's a little. It's a little. It's a he's playing on sort of the American audience that he can't seem to reach. It's worth noting that he was a huge hit in the UK. He'd never had a hit in the US. And he didn't from Diamond Dogs either. Diamond Dogs did pretty well I'm getting to the charts here, but Diamond Dogs did pretty well as an album. It was number five. It reached number five in the album charts, but he had no hit singles from it. I've actually written a separate article about the US version of Rebel Rebel that he released. It became a hit in the UK. In the US, it peaked at number 69. Um, the only hit he'd ever had in the US at that point was a re-release of Space Oddity, which got up to number 15. Nothing else had really hit in the US.
by
Uh,
by 74.
by 74. In
Yeah,
75, fame became number one.
Yeah.
So the next album, which he recorded, of course, in the U.S. in Philadelphia, he had finally found the formula. He co-written song with Carlos Alomar, who came up with the guitar riff, and John Lennon, who came up with some elements of the song. He ended up with a hit. But up until then, he kept trying and trying, and never reached a U.S. audience.
And so okay, that's
So what does the hamburger have to do with
yeah.
that?
But so the reference to is sort of an evocation of Americana.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's about all I can do with that.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of what's going on. I mean, you mentioned the cut up technique, and
Mhm.
presumably, if you're watching the show, you know what that is. But why don't you just explain it, just in case?
Sure. So, literally, it's exactly what it sounds like. He would take a body of work, and then he was drawing on not just William Burroughs, who had written books in this way, but William Burroughs' lover, Brian Gysin, who had done this in art. And before that, Dada artists had done things like this as well. And they would take a body of language, and it wasn't always language, sometimes it was images, but what Bowie would write lyrics this way. He would take a body of language, sometimes his own diaries, sometimes other texts, and literally cut them up. And there's pictures of him taking I'm doing this with my fingers, like of taking lines of language and messing them up, cut them up into pieces. He talked about 5-word chunks and mixing them up, and then they would come together into new forms. And Burroughs would actually leave them in their form. Some of his books are virtually not unreadable, but really difficult to read because they're really relying on the cut-up method. Bowie did something different. Bowie always took the cut-up method and like would only keep what worked, or would shuffle it around again until it worked, right? Until he thought it's kind of expressed something about it. He talked about how he would get at things about himself by inserting this element of randomness into his process. But it was still his process.
Yeah.
As he sings on the Man Who Sold the World, the album, I Never Lost Control, right? He never really quite gives himself over to the cut-up method. He uses it. And that's that using it is a sort of crucial phrase. He talks about using rock and roll as being
Yeah.
his medium. He used the cut-up method to get at things about himself, and that's um, different from William Burroughs, who used the cut-up method to escape himself.
So, in addition to using it to get at something about himself, is he using it to manipulate the audience? Is that another one of his tools?
Interesting question. I don't worry about that. But yeah, I think so. And I think he did talk about how he sometimes would throw things into his songs in order to mess with his audience. And
Yeah.
he's building on some things John Lennon said too. When he did again, John Lennon said that I am the walrus. And they'll be poring over this for years, he said.
Yeah.
The critics will be looking at this for and Bowie was kind of the same way. And sometimes the Bewley Brothers is a song dense with imagery. And you can, imagine interpreting it forever. And Bowie kind of sadistically said, those critics will be getting it. They'll be looking at this forever. And he used the cut-up method for that. He would say this just I'm just throwing in words here, but they're going to look for my intentions. And he knew that people cared about what he intended.
Yeah.
Um,
And
he knew, he messed with that. He messed with people's minds in that way.
he was keeping them all. I mean, us, right? You and me,
Yeah,
keeping
us,
them
yeah,
off balance, right?
yes.
And he's creating. Even when we're talking about something as silly as the word hamburger, he's creating evocative images rather than
Hmm.
explicit descriptions, and that sort of leads me to transition into one of the themes of the album that you write quite a bit about, which it's fascism. You mentioned 1984, and that's the album is, at least the second half, as you point out, is partially inspired by 1984. And I'm going to once again paraphrase something that you wrote. For Bowie, fascism is not at its core a political system. Rather, it is a psychological structure and a social relationship, one that can be seen as easily in its connection between rock star and their fans as it can be seen between in political leaders' connection with their followers.
Mm-hmm.
So why am I asking you about that now is if it's a feeling or a psychological state, does it benefit the manipulative leader to disorient the audience?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, clearly, yes.
Mm.
Is that an insight that Bowie has? Maybe. Maybe that's how you would connect. It's not something I write about. Again, but maybe that's how you get from the more chaotic aspects of and the more random aspects and the cut up aspects of Diamond Dogs into the discussion of authoritarianism,
Yeah,
which does really, I think it's there on the first side of the album. And remember, we all had sides of albums back then when that came out. But it's there on the first side, but it becomes a systematic issue on the second side, both because he's dealing with there's 3 songs titled after phrases from 1984,
yeah,
one of which is called 1984, We Are the Dead and Big Brother. But he's also talking about it in songs like Rock and Roll With Me, which opens the side. So, yeah.
yeah. So I this is not also something you didn't write about, but it was inspired by something that you did.
Mhm.
Um, I think of Bowie like professional wrestling and certain politicians
Yeah.
are demanding of their audience that they enter into an immersive false reality
Hmm.
where, like in 1984, the novel, um, Winston Smith doesn't just need to say 1+1 = 3, but he needs to believe it.
Yes.
So what I mean by immersive false reality is that he's asking his audience not to only suspend their disbelief temporarily, but to never disengage from that suspension of disbelief. And you did write at one point that Bowie was always clear that he was engaged in performance, and that his personas were not necessarily reflections of who he really was. But are you sure about that? Like I've read that when he was going around as Ziggy, everybody had to act like he was Ziggy, and it seemed to me I was very young at that time, but it seemed to me like he was demanding of critics or the audience that they react to him like he was an alien rock star messiah, not like he was playing a part like an actor in a movie might.
Right. I think he was really, to use that word again, a bit ambivalent about that, right?
Yeah,
Because he did make those kinds of demands of people around him, and sometimes he would talk about how he had trouble getting out of his personas, right?
yeah,
I really became Ziggy, he said, and I really became Halloween Jack, to some extent, but I really became these characters that he played, and then he would also say, but I was just playing the character. He would call himself the actor. He went into acting, of course, in parts of his career. So he would do both. He would both demand immersion.
yeah,
He would say, "We want you, Big Brother," at the end of the album, at the end of
yeah,
Diamond Dogs.
yeah,
And he would kind of play with it. He would kind of step out of it as well. And he would try to warn you, don't love me too much.
yeah,
But love me, but don't love me too much. Right?
yeah,
So that both those impulses are there. And so he wanted people to believe in him,
yeah.
to
Well,
believe in
that
his
I
performances.
it strikes me that with Diamond Dogs, there's a parallel with Big Brother or with the party, which is they're playing with emotion, but they're also asking, they're asking the citizenry to believe something that they clearly don't believe. Right. So I mean, you reminded me of the last line of 1984, which was Winston loves Big Brother, right?
Right.
And it seems like it was a breakdown of the whole way that his mind worked, right?
Yep.
And it's you've got this other sequence, and again, it's like I never picked up on this, where I mean, I'm going to ask you to describe it at the very beginning of the album, where there's the false crowd sound.
Yes.
And then when he performed this live, and he would play the false crowd sound. So I'm setting you up to explain your observation.
Yeah. So so first of all, on the album, he had first the first thing you get is Future Legend, this 1 minute long song. There's no
Yeah.
singing in it, but he just recites this 2 sentence poem like thing to a bunch of sounds that include all sorts of things. And then that fades out as this crowd sound comes in, and it's a completely fake crowd sound, right? It's actually something that he, that's famously got in the studio, the next studio over the band Faces, Rod Stewart's band, Small Faces, which is the name of the band?
It was, I think it was Faces at
Okay.
that time, but it
Okay.
had been Small Faces.
And it was recording a live album. He went and you can actually hear Rod Stewart's voice on Diamond Dogs at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
He says, hey, at the end of right as Bowie starts singing the first lines of Diamond Dogs. And so there's this cheer, and over the cheer, Bowie says, "This ain't rock and roll. This is genocide."
Yeah.
And it's the weirdest moment on the album in some ways, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
On the
why?
album.
The whole album that's pretty weird.
Yeah.
There's something really creepy about the fact that he seems to be getting a crowd to cheer for genocide.
Yeah.
And like, what? What are you doing? And I don't remember what I thought about that as a kid, actually. I wish I could go back and find out. In concert, which I did not see, but in concert, he would play, instead of Future Legend, he would just play several minutes of animal sounds. Dogs howling, mostly dogs howling, dogs barking and howling. And it'd get louder and louder, and it would kind of blend in with the actual crowd sounds. And then Bowie's voice would say, in a recording, not live, would say, "This ain't rock and roll. This is genocide." Then he would launch into usually the song, the title song, Diamond Dogs, and that would start the concert. Or he would launch into 1984. Actually, sorry, I actually have that wrong. He always launched in 1984 as the first song he played on every concert. Um, so I think he was playing with an audience. Like he on the album, he seems to be getting people to cheer for genocide. But he's not. It's faking. It's fake. It's cut together in the studio. He's doing the same in a concert scene, and it's in the concert scenario itself. He's getting people to cheer. They're actually cheering for Bowie appearing on the stage, right?
Yeah.
And for the opening notes of the song that's most familiar, that's quite familiar to them, 1981 Hopes, 1984. But they do cheer for the line about genocide too. And he's playing with the very thing that he says he's afraid of.
Yeah.
He's most afraid of. He's playing with um, the idea that the rock star and the fascist are interchangeable figures.
Yeah. You wrote his ability to affect his audience was continuous with an authoritarian leader's ability to manipulate a crowd. And
he always believed that. Like
yeah.
or throughout the 70s anyway, he would, and he was exploring that even as he was critical of it. Go on, sorry.
Well, no, your observation about that manipulation of the Future Legend was it really illustrated that how he creates his own fake reality to sort of reinforce. He creates the reality because out of the fake reality that it created. And I'll tell you two things it reminded me of are when I'll say a politician rather than a specific politician plants a story in the paper and then cites the story that he planted as evidence in support of his own position.
Right.
Reminded me of that. And then also a little more random. I recently read a book about the Roman emperors, and
Hmm.
Nero did something that emperors weren't supposed to do. He would act. He would perform. He would go and act on stage, but the
Hmm.
emperor wasn't supposed to do that. So he would wear a mask, but the mask would look like Nero. So there was a confusion about what was reality and what was not. And the book that I was reading was speculating about how that was on purpose, and it reminded me of, again. I mean, what you wrote reminded me of that, but how for a rock star or for a political leader, there's an advantage of keeping the audience or the constituency off balance in terms of what's real and what's not.
Right. Yes, I think he was very committed to that and very afraid of it at the same time.
Yeah,
And that's what he was afraid of, the consequences of doing that, and yet he would keep doing it.
yeah.
He would repeatedly do it, and he wore masks. He would wear masks on stage. He played with masks on stage, and he made a death mask of himself at one point, a mask, a life mask of himself.
Which he'd hold out in front of him, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, that's
yeah,
right. He would hold it out, and then he would do his boxing routine. So like he was as if he was fighting with this image of himself.
yeah.
Couldn't quite do that with a mask, but
So another theme that you touch on that goes throughout the album is, we already sort of mentioned it in passing, is um, sex in a repressive environment. And
hmm
and you observed the novel 1984 and also the album Diamond Dogs. The regime rules through its repression of sexual desire. And my question for you is, so it's something else you wrote, and then I'll ask the question. The animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire, that was the force that would tear the party to pieces. So that was, I think you were
That's a quote. I
quoting
was
from it.
quoting Orwell. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. So my question for you is, did Orwell and Bowie get that wrong? Do contemporary fascist paradigms release the id, at least amongst their supporters?
So, um, hmm, I'm not sure I have a position on that.
Yeah,
But I think Orwell got that more wrong than Bowie.
yeah,
Because I think Bowie at a certain, like for Orwell, or at least Winston in 1984, to the extent that he is the mouthpiece for Orwell,
yeah,
fully believes that exactly what you quoted. That's a line from actually Winston saying that the yeah that the party rules by repressing sexuality.
yeah,
And the whole story of 1984 is this love story. It's a love story, right? It's a heterosexual romantic love story about Winston and Julia, and they free themselves from the regime through sex. Um, there's also a difference I talk about a little bit in the book between Winston and Julia, because Winston really believes the idea that their sex is political. Julia is like, we're gonna have sex. That's great. I like that. It's not really doing anything.
yeah,
Um, and he accuses her of being revolutionary from the waist down at one point.
yeah,
That she doesn't really like have any revolutionary thoughts in her head. It's a kind of sexist observation. To be mild, to be understated a little bit. But Bowie both Bowie believes that too, right? And the song like Rebel Rebel is really all about a kind of, what is that doing in that album, right? What is that pop song doing in the middle of this very weird avant-garde album in some ways? One of the things it's doing is it's a complete release of the id, right?
yeah,
It's a great song. And it's a great release song. Um, but I'm not sure Bowie is sure that that is going anywhere. And in fact, the story, that to the extent that the album tells a story, there's not really a continuous story in it. entirely. But to the extent that it does, it's a story of that going away, right? That doesn't go anywhere. And by the end, we want you, big brother. Right?
Yeah.
And that's desire too, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
actually desire too. Whether it's sexual desire is another question, but it's actually desire. We want you, big brother.
Yeah.
It's a little different from Winston's I love you, big brother,
Right.
but it's not fundamentally different.
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's why I'm as ambivalent as David Bowie is
Yeah.
about whether it actually works that way or not.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about two other themes of the book, one of which you get into in or two other themes of the album, one of which you get into in a fair amount of detail in the book, and the other one you touch on, and I don't think it's a major theme. So I'll do the lesser one first.
Okay.
The French Revolution. So there seems like there are several oblique references to that, both lyrically and musically. What do you think is going on there? And um, one line in particular that I've come to think is actually more meaningful than I thought for, the first 39 years of listening to the album was the line about the blood of tree cutters, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. But what do you think is going on there? Why all the references to the French Revolution?
So yes, I smell the blood of the les tricoteurs, he
Yeah.
sings. So it goes into French.
Yeah.
Uses a French word. And the les tricoteurs were somewhat potentially mythical women who stood under the guillotine and sewed hats. Knit. They were knitters. That's
Yeah.
what it means knitting. Um, and they would knit the hats and get spattered with blood as the heads of people were chopped off at the guillotine. It's pretty gory stuff.
Yeah.
Something that Bowie probably encountered in that there's some evidence that he saw a movie of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Which movie I'm not sure. And that actually talks the all the different movies as well as the original novel talk about the Tricotas. They're also in The Tale of Two Cities and a couple other novels about the French Revolution. Um, what's it doing there? Uh, Good question. It's for one thing is the smell, right? That's one of the senses that the album talks about, sings about a couple of times. And that's a sense that's most tied to memory. So it brings you back in time. It brings you back to a time of conflict. It brings you
Mhm.
back to a time of revolution, and it brings you back to a time of that turned into authoritarianism, right?
Yeah.
It's for him, the French Revolution is that for anyone British, um, Wordsworth say, the French Revolution is a story of how a release of the id can lead to repression, can lead to
Yeah.
authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So yeah, so going back to your earlier question, that's what that story is, right? That's
Yeah.
to him, and I think that's what that's not the only way of telling the story of the French Revolution, but um, it's the dominant British
Yeah.
version of the French Revolution. So I think that's a lot of what's going on there. Why he brings it up,
Yeah. Yeah.
why he
That
brings it
that,
up.
that makes sense to me because it's like it's a disenchantment, a disillusionment, a revolution that started out with lofty ideals and ends up with Napoleon, right? And
Right.
you know this is in your book, and I do because I read it. But it's not the only reference to the French Revolution, and something that I'd never picked up on until I read it in your book was the the militaristic drum sequence in the same song. You wrote
That's a
that
good thing.
Bowie had said, drum like you're, think about the French Revolution when you're drumming, right? So I forget the exact
Yes.
line, but yeah,
It's the guillotine again. He actually
yeah,
told the drummer to drum as if he were uh standing under the guillotine.
yeah,
Right, must have been right next to the tricotas, though it doesn't say that.
yeah,
And you're drumming for the beheading of people, right?
yeah,
So there's a kind of militaristic and death oriented. There's a lot of death in that song. Up to the end, up to the ending. But there's a lot of he's so even that kind of militaristic sound is this, and it's more than lyrics.
Yeah.
It's more than lyrics and the sound. Yeah.
So for years, especially when I was younger, I thought he was talking about lumberjacks, tree
So
cutters.
did I.
So
So did I.
I didn't know
I will
why.
say
Maybe he was like a Monty Python fan, but that's not what he was saying. So
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
The tree cutters. Yeah. Yep, I had the exact, and I tell an anecdote in the book about how I was kind of obsessed with figuring out the lyrics of the song, but
yes,
I am sure that I typed out I typed and I made up a lyric sheet for the whole album that I
yeah,
then typed onto the sleeve of the album. It was the vinyl album, and I'm sure that I wrote Tree Cutters at
yeah.
that point.
I would be the second most interested person in seeing that list because you wrote that you lost it, but I'm sure
I
you
have
would be
lost it,
the
yeah.
most interested person in seeing it. But yeah,
I would be, though I'm sure I'd also be embarrassed by it because I'm sure I got some, and I'm sure, and I know I never figured out, until, yeah, there's now lyric sites, right? And
yeah,
some of them are wrong. Like some of them actually, for instance, um, they say then instead of thing.
yeah,
If you want it, boys, get it here and then. And that's wrong. So it's
yeah,
very clear when you listen to it that he's saying thing. But I'm sure that my own lyrics, that my own typing, I also got wrong the line about the Trey Butch little number.
yeah.
I know I got that wrong. Because I could not figure, I did not figure that out until I saw it written out in a lyric sheet.
Well, that's another, in the same song, another,
Yep.
use of French, right? It's like on
Right.
some level, he wants you to be thinking about France. And again, it's like
Yes.
a political movement that the tree cutters, in my mind, I associate them with the the bread riots that
Mm.
kicked off the revolution, and there were women marching for what would seem like a good idea, but by the time of the reign of terror, they've been sidelined, and the only satisfaction they could get is sitting next to the guillotines and watching the heads of their enemies roll off. And in my crazy way of thinking, it kind of reminds me of the audience that wants Big Brother at the end of the album, right? They've sort of given up their
They want
agency.
everyone to be executed.
Yeah, and
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how they're represented. I haven't looked back at all the movies and all the books because I think they're represented as having agency, as having different degrees of agencies. To some extent, they've given up.
yeah,
To some extent, they're actively participating in the beheading.
okay, yeah,
And I think that may be even worse in some ways, but
yeah,
they fully believe in the turn that the revolution has taken.
yeah,
Because what they're knitting is the hats that the revolutionaries wear.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and that's that's a real that's an active agential kind of participation.
But they're not getting bread, right? So
Yeah.
I think they love Big Brother, right? But they're not. Big Brother's not serving their need as a
They're getting blood instead of bread, I suppose.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure they're the same. What's the movie that kind of glorifies the French Revolution? That's based on the Zola novel. Why can't I remember the title suddenly?
the history of the
Um,
world, the Mel Brooks movie.
no, not that one.
No,
No, that does have that in it, doesn't it? It does have the bread riots in it, doesn't it? Uh,
Les Miserables.
mm, yes, Les Miserables. Yes. And it's, yeah, that has the bread riots in it, but
Yeah,
does not have and has the and has does not those women don't end up, because it has a much more positive view of the French Revolution in general, and
yeah,
so it does not have those same women turn into les tricoteuses,
yeah.
which is a
So
bit
let me
more
ask you about
sadistic.
one more theme, and then
Hmm.
I've got a couple closing questions. One of which is silly. So the one
Okay,
more theme
I
that we
like silly
really,
questions.
yeah, the transformation. So the album cover that's behind me, right? And again, that was something I learned from your book that I didn't know that I'm going to write a separate thing about is the connection between this image and a photograph of Josephine Baker. But I'm
Yes.
not going to ask you about that. I'm going to ask you about
Okay.
this.
Oh.
So the theme of transformation, and you made the observation that on this album, Bowie does not transform into an alien, but an animal. And so I wanted to ask you about the significance, and just to set a little more context, that part human, part animal comes up again and again with Bowie. The Minotaur and Outside, Gail
Yeah.
Ann Dorsey's horse costume on stage that she would wear that he designed. He designed a costume where she had a tail and hooves. And
Wow. I don't think I know about that.
well, the other one that I was going to note was in this video for Black Star. One of the last things that David Bowie put out. There's a girl with a tail, right? So
Yes.
and one other note, which is sort of not exactly the same, but again going back to Outside, there's a reference to 8 men with metal parts, which I kind of thought was, instead of half human, half animal, it's half animal, half machine. And
Yes.
what is going on there? So what's the significance of the animal transformation, and what's the significance of the half human, half animal?
So, in the book, I talk about wild mutations, right? That's a line. That's a line from the Ziggy Stardust album, from the
Yeah,
song "Star." I make
yeah,
a wild mutation to be a rock and roll star. And so one of the
yeah,
things he thinks of, he thinks is you have to make certain changes in yourself to be a
yeah,
rock and roll star, to identify with a rock and roll star, and that those changes, those transformations, are to some extent, you know, are like you have to dress up, you have to do surface things, um, but sometimes you have to mutate. You actually have to change your identity. And he's that's what he's singing about, and that's what he is exemplifying in these images. Also, is this actual just changes in your identity. Why they're part animal, I think he's drawing here from Burroughs, and then from and then the idea that boys and dogs are interchangeable and so on. Boys are kind of wild animals in Burroughs, the wild boys. But I don't know why. I've never figured out why, for instance, that woman gets a tail in that
yeah,
Black Star video.
yeah,
It's fascinating, and I think you're exactly right that it's continuous with um, the image behind you, which we can't quite see all of, at least in my image,
yeah,
but is Bowie is half man, half dog,
right,
and he has he's literally turned and merged with an animal. And in the original album cover, which now has been resuscitated in certain album covers, the genitals of that dog. Oh, there we go.
yeah,
Right here in this, but in this one, which is the one I owned as a kid, there's a blackout of the genitalia.
yeah, yeah,
But um, but at any rate, he's he's clearly kind of merged with the dog. It's the front part of him that is the Josephine Baker part, right? And that's well, you didn't ask about that, but
I
uh,
didn't ask about, but I'll show the picture.
oh, okay, great.
Right,
Yes. So she's doing a similar a similar thing with her hands. And he actually gave a picture of Josephine Baker. We're not completely sure it's that one, but he gave a picture of Josephine Baker to Guy Pielart. And my Dutch pronunciation is especially bad. Uh, who painted that album cover. So, and that's a kind
yeah.
of reference picture. So we know that he was thinking of her when he did this.
I never knew that until I read your book. I did one thing that I wanted to find the picture, right? As soon as I read that, I wanted to
Mm.
find the picture. And I did note, you now we're talking about this picture. I decided we weren't going to, but you noted that she takes on feline qualities, and he takes on dog-like qualities. But I also noticed in the picture she's leaning on what looks like an animal skin rug or an animal.
And
Uh,
Emily, yeah, she actually had a pet cheetah.
yeah,
She actually owned a pet cheetah, which that is not clearly in that
yeah,
image. But that looks like a full-fledged tiger, and it doesn't look alive.
yeah,
But she walked around Paris with a pet cheetah on a leash.
yeah. So I'm going to ask you the silly question now, which is usually
Okay.
the last question I ask, but I have a different last question for you. So
Okay.
the silly question that I ask everybody, and it might be obvious with you, what's your favorite Bowie album and your favorite Bowie song?
So song, it's the sweet thing sweet.
Yeah,
There's no doubt about it. I think it's got everything that is great about David Bowie in it, and I talk about that in the book. But
yeah.
it's like it's got his full range of singing. It's got this weird playing. It's got different kinds of melody. It's got everything. It's got by the end of it, you're in a noise song, right? You're in a completely different world. And it's great. It's got some good, but I when I was sitting down to write this book, when I was preparing to write this book, um, I was not sure whether I was going to write about this or Ziggy Stardust, which is also a great album. It's
Yeah,
I kind of had I what I realized talking to a friend is that I had less to say about Ziggy Stardust. It's like, yeah,
yeah,
that's great. Is not a very good album, not a good, very good argument.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
the songs are really well constructed. The sequencing, with the couple of exceptions, is really good. It's a really great album, and I might have written about that, and I might have written about Black Star, and I might have written about someone else has written a book about scary monsters recently, who you've had on, I think.
Adam,
It's
yeah,
another Adam
great book.
Steiner. It's a great book. And it's a case of depends on the day time,
Right.
with a day,
Yeah.
which is my favorite David Bowie album. When Scary Monsters came out, it was by far my favorite. That album just blew me away. But Diamond Dogs is an album that I come back to, and I say this at the end of the book, but I really do listen to it again and see new things in it. That's to some extent true of Scary Monsters. And when I read Adam's book, it was like, oh, I never heard that before. That's great. And he
Yeah.
likes some songs that I never really listened to carefully too. That also happens when when you read about an album. It's like, oh, that's that song that I kind of skipped over, or listened to but didn't really listen to. It's much more interesting than I thought it was. I like that.
Up the hill
Kind of a silly
backward,
question.
right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
the one. Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
that's just like, no, that's just some Bo Diddley thing that it's got a recognizable beat, but it's got so many references. It's got so
Yeah.
much going on in it. Yeah, and
So
Adam Steiner brings that up.
you're actually bleeding into my actual least last question for you because I thought the
Okay.
way you ended the book was I thought it was wonderful. Where I'm gonna partially quote it. Diamond Dogs. You just said it, so you stole my question.
Yeah.
Diamond Dogs is
I'm
one of the
sorry.
very few older albums that I play regularly, not because of its familiarity, but because it still holds surprises for me. And then you close the book with, I think I'll go play Diamond Dogs again now. I wonder what I'll hear this time. And so my closing question for you is this: is since you wrote the book, what else have you discovered?
uh, yes. I'm not sure. This is a much more serious and less silly question, isn't it? Uh, I'm not sure I could name something on the album I've discovered since then. I've listened to it a lot to write the book,
Yeah,
and in a way that kind of exhausted it, but in a way it opened things up too. So I've
yeah,
mentioned that after having written the book, suddenly I was in touch with like so I ended up like Mike Garson, his Bowie's piano player, very generously just said, I'm doing a listening party during the pandemic. I'm doing an online listening party for Diamond Dogs. Why don't you co-host it with me? So, okay. And I had a phone conversation with David Cherry. I had an email exchange with Jeff McCormick, Bowie's childhood friend. And there's I've gotten to know Carlos Alomar a little bit lately. So there's a lot of connections with Bowie related people that came out. So there's things I learned and things conversations I've had because of having written the book,
yeah,
not so much things on the album. I fear I exhausted the album. I feel like I
yeah,
got
yeah,
everything. I fear that I got everything out of it. And as I mentioned to you before we started, I initially wrote twice as much
yeah,
as is in this book. It's not the shortest 33 1/3 ever, and it was twice as long when I first turned it in.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. There's a lot to be said about this album.
Yeah. Well, I would first of all, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the book, and
Thank you.
you know, I when we're wrap this up, I'm going to go listen to Diamond Dogs again. So I,
You know, maybe I will too.
yeah,
Maybe I'll hear something. Maybe I will hear something new this time.
yeah. Well, Glenn, this has been terrific.
No pleasure.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite albums, and I could talk about it for a long time. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I enjoyed your book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I enjoyed it too. And I was gonna say you're an excellent reader as
Yeah,
well as listener. So it was really a pleasure to talk to you about the book and about the album.
thank you. I'm glad we met, and please let's stay in touch.
Please.